From the Rio Grande to the Mediterranean, from the English Channel to the River Jordan, from Poland to South Africa, the existential threat to national sovereignty is the same: asylum. Not abuse of asylum, but asylum policy itself. In a 2019 statement on the border emergency, President Trump said, "A nation without borders is not a nation at all." And what asylum does is not lead to open borders. This, I think, is a mistake in our terminology. There's still somebody at the border. What it does is it takes away the ability of democratic governments to control who enters and lives in their own countries. Since the end of the Cold War, the forces opposed to the very idea of the nation have made increasing use of the post-World War II asylum regime to subvert the ability of self-governing peoples to control who enters and remains in their own countries. The current system, usually referred to just as refugee system, but in our law, in US law, there's a difference between refugees and asylum, was established in 1951 with the Convention relating to the status of refugees. Only applied to people in Europe, and it only applied to people who had been displaced before the convention was ratified or signed. In other words, people displaced by World War II and the Red Army subjugation of Eastern Europe. That framework was then universalized in 1967 in what is called the Protocol relating to the status of refugees, which was exactly the same. It just applied to everywhere in the world and applied prospectively in the future. And there are two aspects to this, one of which is not problematic. The other is, I think, the fundamental existential threat to national sovereignty. The first one is refugee resettlement. This is a sovereign act where a person who is in a camp or something overseas is brought into a country of resettlement. It could be a good idea, bad idea, it could be done well, or it could be done poorly, but it is a sovereign act of the nation involved. The other part, and this is the problematic part, is asylum. Asylum is for an alien who is already in the country, usually illegally, and then seeks refugee status as a way of avoiding deportation. It represents a surrender of sovereignty, a pledge to permit foreigners to decide who's going to live in your country rather than the citizens of that country. It reframes immigration as a right rather than a privilege, a claim that an illegal immigrant can make against a country regardless of what the laws of that country set as far as levels and characteristics of immigration. Essentially, it makes border control contingent on international treaties. Now, the framers of the original version, the 1951 convention, understood this potential threat to sovereignty, and so they included various provisos and caveats, the most important one of which is that illegal immigrants must be considered for asylum, but only if they come directly from the country where they were being persecuted. The thing is that during the first 4 decades of this asylum regime, the surrender of sovereignty that asylum represents wasn't really much of an issue. Because the United States did not sign on to the original convention because the Truman administration rightly considered the threat to national sovereignty. But in 1967, we did sign on to the universalizing version of it, the protocol, because what harm could it do? And the reason it wasn't a problem is because asylum essentially was reserved for a handful of Russian ballerinas. It was a tiny phenomenon, and so the surrender of national sovereignty that asylum represents was not all that consequential or salient. But 4 things have happened in the intervening in the last 30 years that fundamentally changed that. One is the Cold War has ended. One of the reasons the nations of the free nations of the world were able to talk about asylum as a right is that almost nobody could get out of the Soviet Empire. And so it was almost a kind of virtue signaling that we weren't called on, we weren't challenged on what asylum could represent because the handful of people got out were easily accommodated. That's gone. There is no Cold War, obviously. It was 30 years ago, even though many people still think it's going on, it isn't. The second change is huge growth in global population, especially in the kind of developing countries where poverty and disorder and misrule create powerful incentives to leave. The third change is the huge drop in the cost of transportation and communications. Everybody knows this is true, but I looked up a couple of numbers just to kind of give that some shape. In 1950, around the time they were putting together the Refugee Convention, 3-minute phone call from Boston to London in current dollars cost $50 a minute. Now it's free. Everybody has mobile phones. Anybody who's watched a Fox News video from the border, you see all of the people coming across have mobile phones. Communication is now essentially free. Transportation, likewise, dramatically less expensive than it was. When I was a kid, we put on our Sunday best to go on a plane because it was a big deal before Eric was born. But the fact is now it's like a Greyhound bus. It's dramatically cheaper, so people can get here. But even all of that isn't enough. Yes, the Cold War is over. Yes, population growth is dramatic in the third world. It's cheaper to get here and to collect information. But the fourth change is key, and that is that the elites of modern countries have lost the cultural self-confidence necessary to actually defend their countries. John Lennon's song, Imagine, is the shahada of global progressivism. And its line, imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, is precisely what most of our leadership class now imagines. These changed conditions, these four changes over the past 30 years, have turned asylum seeking into the main vehicle of mass illegal immigration. We've all seen this. I won't go into too much detail about what we've seen, but the 2015-2016 migration crisis in Europe was driven by asylum, ostensibly. In fact, Angela Merkel said something which I think really highlights the problem here. At the time, she was asked, well, how many refugees can Germany take? Apparently, even reporters were kind of aghast at what was happening. And she said this, quote, I assume this is a translation, "The basic right to asylum for politically persecuted persons has no upper limit. This also applies to refugees who come to us from the hell of a civil war." This is the logical endpoint of the 1951 refugee and asylum regime. And that what happened in Europe pales beside what we're seeing at our own southern border. This administration, ostensibly because people are seeking protection, has taken into custody and then let go more than 3.5 million illegal border crossers, on top of all kinds of other ways that illegal immigrants get into the country. And it's not just here. You're seeing it now in the Mediterranean. You saw a few years ago, Belarus tried to weaponize asylum policy against the EU by inviting Middle Eastern illegal immigrants in and then busing them to the Polish border, the point being it was to punish Europe because once they're in Europe, they can't, it's the leadership classes of those countries simply do not have the will or even the inclination to remove those people. So there's been some responses to try to keep the asylum system in place, to preserve it, but to rein in the abuses of it. Remain in Mexico was a policy that the Trump administration adopted, formerly called the Migrant Protection Protocols, where illegal immigrant border jumpers were still allowed to apply for asylum in the United States, but had to wait in Mexico for their hearings. And it was very effective, but a half measure because it kept in place the magnet of applying for asylum. Various countries, Israel, Britain, and Denmark, tried to deal with the asylum threat by forming an agreement with Rwanda to deport rejected asylum seekers to Rwanda if they couldn't be deported to their own countries. Israel did it for a few years until their Supreme Court decided it was unreasonable and just canceled it. Denmark, for some reason, shelved it, never really launched it, and Britain now with the new Labour government has canceled their, the agreement with Rwanda. Italy has tried something similar. I call it Remain in Albania, where illegal immigrants coming to Italy are sent to Albania for processing, but they still are permitted to apply for asylum in the EU, and so the magnet is still there. The problem is that these are all second best solutions. They're not solutions. They're attempts at dealing with asylum and the problems it creates by trying to deal with the margins. The fact is that any administrative measures like this can always be undone by subsequent administrations, and the pull of asylum, the potential of it is still there. And asylum, even asylum law, even its abuse is limited, that pull still remains. The big reason being that one of the grounds for getting asylum is being persecuted based on membership in a particular social group, which means whatever a judge and an activist want it to mean. And so however effective the guardrails are around it, that particular weakness remains. And so fixing this problem of asylum must start by withdrawing from the Refugee Convention and the Protocol, and withdrawing from the Convention Against Torture, and withdrawing from the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights. All of those create rights for infiltrators, illegal immigrants, coming into developed countries. And specifically in the case of Europe, European countries are not going to be able to regain control of their borders until they withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, which is something Nigel Farage and his Reform Party, one of the issues they were campaigning on. And the immigration right that all these agreements create is specifically a requirement of what's in French is called non-refoulement. Non-refoulement, it would be in English, but that's not a word in English, so we use, in other words, not to send people back to where they're being persecuted. The problem is not that we should be sending people back to where they're being killed or persecuted. The imperative of this really etched itself in our leadership class after World War II when we sent back Soviet POWs that we had liberated back to Stalin, and they were all killed. So the idea of non-refoulement is still valid. The problem is it needs to be up to national governments to decide who they will and will not send back. Broad national agreements trying to limit the sovereignty of developed countries are even worse than some of the other broad international agreements. And the thing that comes to mind to me is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Those of you who've studied diplomatic history will know, and it's still in effect. Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1920s banned war. War is illegal, just in case anybody was in doubt about that. One of the skeptics in the Senate, when it was up for ratification, referred to as an international kiss. But he said, if we are going to throw a kiss, let us understand that it does not carry with it any obligation of matrimony. The problem is that the international kiss, represented by the Refugee Convention, the Torture Convention, the Covenant on Civil and Human Rights, does create obligations, and those obligations are weaponized by anti-sovereignty elements within our own countries to prevent self-governing peoples from governing themselves. And so what we need to do in subsequent to withdrawing from these conventions is by legislation to prohibit by law any asylum claim from an illegal immigrant. There is no way to get around this. As a movie from the 1980s said, the only way to win is not to play the game. The one twist or issue that we're going to have to consider is there are still going to be some people who manage to illegally immigrate whom either we don't want to send back or whom we can't send back because their country won't cooperate. And in order to deal with that, something like the British and Israeli Rwanda agreement is going to be necessary. I call it Remain in Mongolia, so that no one who crosses the border illegally is even permitted to submit an asylum claim. There is no claim of protection that we even entertain, but we will fly them to Mongolia or Bolivia or whatever country we have an agreement with, and it's going to require us to pay large bribes and buy their mistresses apartments and all of that. But whatever it takes, it can be done. And the British Foreign Office did extensive research into in what countries could be persuaded to do this. And they came up with a useful list. I don't think Mongolia was on it, but Botswana was on it, Armenia was on it. There's all kinds of countries that'll be willing to take our money in order to host a small number of illegal immigrants. And the point, of course, is the numbers won't be large, because if sneaking across the American border simply lands you in Ulaanbaatar, which I hear it's nice this time of year, but nonetheless, that's not what you're looking for. And the incentive is going to disappear, and the number of people that Mongolia or wherever would have to accommodate on our behalf isn't going to be that large. So my basic takeaway here is that asylum is not something we can tweak around the edges and try to limit abuses and make it better. Those are all things that, if in the short term we have to do, I'm all for. But ultimately, asylum must not be available to illegal immigrants, period. Otherwise, there is no ability for countries attracting immigration to actually succeed in controlling their borders. Thank you.